Hi, kids. In our last article, we starting out our study of the Great Depression. We read the Into the Abyss article, and we saw the beginnings of the Great Depression, along with all of the suffering that went on in the early years of the Great Depression, 1930, 1931, 1932. Even 33 and 34, because it took a while to kind of stop that train. And then we saw the rise of Franklin Roosevelt and his election in 1932 and the New Deal, where they created all these programs to try and help people out during the tough times of the Great Depression. What we're going to read about here today, there's a little bit of that continues on, but really this is more about life in the Great Depression for regular people. We're not going to talk quite so much about like the president and what was going on there. There will be some mention, especially at the beginning. But this is more about, okay, what did it mean for people who were living through the Great Depression? What did they have to deal with? What were they hoping that how their lives might get better? So the title of this article is "The Only Thing We Have to Fear Is Fear Itself," which is what Franklin Roosevelt said during his first inaugural speech. Basically, just saying, "Hey, let's go, everybody. It's all of us together, and nothing to be afraid of. We will, the only thing that we need to be afraid of is just not doing anything because we're so afraid." So that's where that line comes from. So let's take a look at it. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Please follow along while I read. Life in the Great Depression. When the unemployment rate skyrocketed in the early years of the Great Depression, women and minorities were the first and hardest hit. They were often said to be the last hired and the first fired for any job, even in good economic times. When times went bad, women and minorities bore the brunt. Most women looking for jobs in the Depression struggled. If they were in competition with men for a job, they would almost always lose out. Even professions that were traditionally dominated by women, such as librarians and school teachers, found themselves competing with men for jobs. Many women who worked as maids or other types of domestic help also lost jobs as people tried to save money. FDR's wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, took a keen interest in the rights of women and minorities, and in doing so transformed the role of First Lady. She made frequent radio speeches and championed women's rights. She took a much higher profile than previous First Ladies had ever done. She wanted to be involved in the work that her husband was doing. The Great Depression hit African Americans particularly hard. By 1932, more than half of African Americans were unemployed. They found it hard to get jobs and hard to keep them in tough times, proving the last hired and first fired maxim that has plagued minorities and women throughout American history. When Franklin Roosevelt was elected president in 1932, African Americans supported him heavily. This marked a shift in the voting trends that existed for years. Since African Americans received voting rights in the 1860s, they had traditionally supported the Republican Party since it was the party of Abraham Lincoln. However, over time, the Republican Party proved to be less and less committed to civil rights. When Roosevelt promised to improve civil rights for African Americans with the New Deal, they switched their support to the Democrats. Even today, the African American community heavily supports the Democratic Party. Unfortunately, while Roosevelt was sympathetic to African Americans and his wife Eleanor passionately campaigned for many civil rights causes, his record on civil rights was mixed. Roosevelt found that in order to get much of his New Deal legislation passed, he needed the support of Southern senators and representatives, all of whom were vehemently against civil rights. So he compromised and backed off his civil rights demands in many cases in order to get New Deal legislation passed. Roosevelt's rationale was that the New Deal would benefit everybody who was struggling, African Americans included. Still, it was disappointing, and meaningful civil rights legislation would not really start to appear for another 15 years. Roosevelt tried to make symbolic gestures towards minorities to remind them that he supported their cause. This included having African-American singer Marian Anderson perform on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial after she was denied being allowed to perform at a Daughters of the American Revolution hall. Still, the Great Depression was a very tough time for minorities. Many migrant workers from Mexico who picked crops in the American Southwest were deported so as to preserve those jobs for whites instead. Laws like the Indian New Deal, which specifically attempted to ease the poverty and injustice suffered by Native Americans, were few and far between. And there you see a picture of Marian Anderson performing on the steps of Lincoln Memorial. The Dust Bowl. Some of what caused suffering during the Great Depression was simply horrible luck. In the 1930s, the American Southwest experienced a severe drought, which destroyed farmland in the southwestern plains of the United States. The area hardest hit, roughly the states of Oklahoma, Arkansas, Kansas, New Mexico, and the northern half of Texas, became known as the Dust Bowl. Farmers in the 1920s had cleared huge plots of land with new mechanical farming equipment. This made farming much easier, but it also inadvertently cleared a lot of the native grasses and roots from the soil. When the rains failed in the 1930s, the top layer of soil simply blew away in the wind. Huge dust storms sprang up that were locally known as black blizzards and made noon look like midnight. They buried fences, seeped into houses, and killed people and animals. Some people from that region simply lost everything they had to head west to California to find work as migrant workers. Californians scornfully referred to them as Okies, since so many of them came from the state of Oklahoma. Life there was only slightly better than it had been back in the Dust Bowl region as they tried to scrape out some kind of decent life. The Dust Bowl had nothing to do with bank failures, the stock market, or any of the other economic factors of the Great Depression. It was an example of short-sighted environmental policies that eventually caused enormous suffering and made that region the very worst of the worst during the Depression. Arts during the Depression. The arts flourished during the Great Depression. Often tough times bring out huge amounts of creativity in human beings as they seek to express themselves and alleviate their suffering. John Steinbeck's classic novel of the Depression, The Grapes of Wrath, told the story of a family of Okies headed west, trying to keep their family in dignity even as they suffered. The photographer Dorothea Lange's Depression-era photos became world famous, chronicling the suffering of people all over the country. Movies became popular as never before. The era became known as the Golden Age of Hollywood. Unlike today, movies were relatively cheap to go and see and were one of the leisure activities that people could still afford. So the most popular movies of the Depression were designed with the goal of helping people forget their problems. Fantasies such as The Adventures of Robin Hood or The Wizard of Oz, where a girl escapes the Kansas Dust Bowl into a fantasy world, were hugely popular. One of the biggest stars of the 1930s was a child actress, Shirley Temple, whose movies were very popular as well. She usually played an orphan who would help two people fall in love, and the three of them would live happily ever after as a family by the end. Radio was the biggest entertainment medium of the 1930s, and virtually everyone had one. In those days, radio was more like TV. There were shows on all the time, such as comedies, westerns, science fiction, as well as music. Daytime radio dramas known as soap operas were extremely popular in the Depression. Soap operas had a continuing story that went on and often hooked the audience so they would never miss an episode. Those shows were typically on in the afternoon and were very popular among the unemployed for the diversion they provided. Soaps were so popular that when TV became popular 20 years later, many radio soap operas from the Depression became TV shows. Some continue today. The legacy of the New Deal. Some aspects of the New Deal went away as the nation pulled itself out of the Depression. Some programs are still with us today. One way or another, the New Deal fundamentally changed the way people viewed the role of government in America. Before the Great Depression, government tended to shy away from involvement in social and economic life. The suffering of the 1930s was so profound, though, that a fundamental change occurred in what Americans expected from their government. Essentially, government took charge of the safety net to make sure that if another depression happened, that it would not be as damaging as the Great Depression was. The Social Security Act established a national pension plan, trying to ensure that Americans would not slip into poverty in their old age. The National Labor Relations Act guaranteed workers' rights to unionize and collective bargaining with their employers. At the same time, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO, became a powerful new labor union. The way the CIO was organized opened up union membership to many more people than unions had in the past, particularly women and African Americans. The New Deal was not without its critics, though, and the debate continues today. Those against it said that the New Deal gave federal government too much power and that it cost too much. Certainly, the huge increases in federal programs come at a monetary cost, and the federal government does have much more power than it did during the Coolidge-Hoover days. Critics also say that it wasn't the New Deal at all that helped the nation out of the Depression. World War II did that. However, the New Deal was hugely popular among most Americans in its day and continues to provide a framework for what many Americans believe is the proper role of government in the United States. Its supporters say that the New Deal employed the jobless, ended the banking crisis, reformed the economy, saved people from losing their homes, and improved working conditions. According to the New Dealers, it also restored faith in American government, which was deeply shaken during the Hoover administration. People began to believe they had been abandoned by a ruling class that cared nothing for the struggles of ordinary Americans. Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal provided a path back to the promise that many Americans believed was lost in the early days of the Great Depression. So, like I said, a little bit more about the life during the Great Depression, giving you an idea of what different groups they all had their own struggles. Everybody had to deal with it. Some people dealt with it worse than others, depending on where you lived in the United States, what the color of your skin was, all that kind of stuff. Those problems that still exist with us today. But it also chronicles kind of the steps that were taken, and even things like radio and movies that didn't necessarily have anything to do with the Great Depression, but they flourished during the Great Depression because people were looking for a way to express how they felt about what they were going through, and people do that. Tough times tend to bring out great creativity from people because they're looking for that outlet to try and show that creativity. So that's where we're at right now. In our next article, we'll take a little bit more of a look at that sort of mass media thing with one particular character. Okay, see you then.